I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the City Council's budget overview. Marjana, can you please call the roll?
Fulkaitis.
Here.
Foltz.
Here.
Bungard.
Here.
Munns.
Here.
Lancioni. Gem.
Here.
Petrilla.
Here.
Wirbel.
Here.
Bessner.
Here.
Weber.
Here.
Okay, I'll just make a few comments to open because I know we have some great presentations from staff. We've done something similar to this before. As you all know, about 2+ years ago, we did do a strategic plan that had community engagement. All you participated, staff did as well. The budget overview, or the budget, is basically the product of that. So, as you know, when we plan things, it takes staff. I'll use one example, the pedestrian bike plan. When we bring that up in strategic planning and staff go through the process to become budget, there are so many things that have to go into planning. So engineering, community engagement, planning. So these things don't just happen overnight, as everyone knows, and staff know that too. But that's why the strategic planning that you all do to set policy helps them to drive the budget. Nothing should be usually a surprise. It's something that you brought to staff as something that's important to you, important to our city. And so we're here today. Staff can talk us through some of those things. But what I will say I know is that we have to make decisions through the year, things like tax levy. Budget conversation is nonstop. So even though we have this budget overview and we go through the budget process, tonight, these are things you should be thinking of in preparation to make those decisions come the following year. So, no surprise when you make those decisions. And then also, as we continue to plan, we will be doing a strategic planning refresh in the summer. The strategic plans, as you know, our community is changing constantly, and staff are keeping up with the policy and the things that council wants to do, the things our residents want. So we do need to refresh that so it doesn't stay static and get old and we're operating on a strategic plan that is outdated. So having said all that, I'll turn it over to City Administrator for some comments.
Thank you, Mayor, and I will be extremely brief. I know that Bill has put together a really comprehensive overview this evening. This is not intended to get into the fine line detail of our budget. We will be presenting a full draft budget in March before it's actually approved by City Council. The one comment I really want to make, and I will jump in with Bill throughout this presentation this evening, is just to keep in mind some of the commentary that I know I've been harping on for the last few years, and that is a lot of the projects that we have been looking at as a city, things that are necessary for our operations, have been deferred for a number of years. Some of those were strategic, some of those were based on economy, some of those were based on a lot of things that were going on both with the city and locally and nationally. Unfortunately, we were at a point where some of those projects have started to come to the point that we are not in a place to continue to defer them, and our revenue streams have not necessarily kept up with the projects that are going to need to be done. So you'll see slides about halfway through that kind of focus on the comprehensive list of projects that we're really looking at as a staff and the dollar amount associated with those, and really going to have to take a hard look at some of the things that are absolutely necessary just to keep the city operationally at a place that it needs to be for services to residents. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, and like I said, I will interject commentary, and please, if you have questions as we're going through this, let us know, and we will answer those as best we can.
And does anyone have any questions before we start, just to make sure? And then also, if anyone needs to use the restroom, feel free to get up there. So we think the presentation is moving along.
This one here. Okay, thank you very much, and good to see everybody. Tonight we're going to be walking through, as previously discussed, kind of an overview of some of the big picture issues we've been talking about as we've been working our way through this budget process. We are in the middle of our budget process right now. We have been having conversations focused primarily on capital needs, capital items that have been out there for a while. We are working our way through operating budgets started today, as well as revenue. So I would say we're roughly about 75% through our budget process right now. So we wanted to give an update on those, where we're at with certain things, primarily focused on revenues, some personnel adjustments, and primarily focusing the rest of the presentation on capital projects and giving an update on some of the key capital projects that have been talked about and where the city's at with some of those. As Heather indicated, we anticipate formalizing a draft budget by late February, early March, with final approval of that budget scheduled for April. So, as always, please ask questions or stop me as we're walking through this. As you know, the city established 4 priorities out of its strategic planning process. One was dealing with financial wellness, to implement policies, practices, and procedures to manage long-term liabilities, increase awareness of the city's fiscal condition, and continue with the efficient use of city resources to ensure financial strength and sustainability. Out of that strategic plan priority came several strategic goals related to financial wellness. One was to ascertain the level of revenues needed to support the city's core capital project programs with ongoing revenues. This was substantially completed with the implementation of the increase in the home rule sales tax in '23, generating roughly $4.7 million a year for the city's core street and infrastructure program. 2 was to evaluate and implement utility rates to provide the necessary resources for the city's water, sewer, and electric systems. This is ongoing. We had a series of 5% increases applied to the water and sewer utilities in 2024. At the same time, there's no recommended increases in the electric rates.
And just as a quick reminder, too, this was the 5% increases that we agreed to last fiscal year were part of an attempt to get our rates to where they needed to go after several years. We did not implement the rates that were recommended in our rate study based on the infrastructure needs that we had. We will be going through a new rate study to give us some recommendations, but this is, as we work through some of these slides, just going to be a reminder why we have that rate study in place and the importance of following that to ensure that we can actually sustain the infrastructure needs of that system.
One was to analyze the city's charges for service for development-related items to better understand those costs. That is ongoing. The 4th was to deal with budget transparency and fiscal transparency. We are continuing to make improvements to our annual budget document, and so that is ongoing as well. Number 5 was to maintain an appropriate general fund reserve balance in relation to the city's overall financial position. That is always ongoing. We did use a very measured, targeted amount of reserves last year for specific purposes. We'll touch on where we're at in our budgeting process right now if we're at a point to recommend that as well. But that is something that is really an ongoing thing. And the last one was to implement the debt management policy, which was done back in '22. Just a quick recap on recent progress made. I know this has been touched on before, but we did complete the first increased road and infrastructure maintenance improvement program in 2024 due to the additional dedicated funds. There's been a lot of facility maintenance projects over the last couple of years that have been addressed related to roofs and HVACs and various facilities across in different areas. Resources have obviously been allocated towards various strategic plan goals, and that has been talked about in previous presentations. The First Street TIF extension was approved earlier several months ago. There's still a process where the city has to approve a redevelopment to the actual TIF redevelopment plan, and that process is ongoing, but with that approval, the city will be able to make sure that those obligations which enable the First Street development are paid with TIF funds. We have been able to reduce our outstanding general obligation debt utilizing other resources in a targeted manner over the last several years. That will give the city some flexibility to meet the future needs going forward. And as we'll talk later, we are moving forward with some key water and sewer projects that have been identified through previous master planning processes. So there's a lot of numbers on this chart. You're wondering, Bill, why did you put this up here? I can barely read it. I really just wanted to illustrate the fact that that first column there, our general fund, we did pass a general fund budget, a balanced general fund budget for this year, roughly $65 million. And the other 4 major funds are our electric utility, that second column, our water, sewer, and our capital improvements fund. The one thing I did want to point out with our water, sewer, and capital is that we did strategically use some of the accumulated monies that we had set aside in those funds for various capital projects this year. That's why you see the expenditures and transfers out more than the revenue transfers in for those funds. There were a lot of very critical capital needs that needed to get addressed, and we looked at our reserves and decided that was an appropriate use in those funds for this fiscal year. We'll have less flexibility this current upcoming year to do that, but I wanted to point out that we were moving forward with some of those projects in this current fiscal year.
And a big part of the rationale for doing that was to minimize that rate increase on the taxpayers and the users of the system. But as Bill just said, we are at a point now where we're not going to be able to continue to sustain that. That's something that's a short-term, maybe 1-year fix, depending on where our reserves are at. But we did use that to minimize that rate increase that we're just not going to be able to repeat again.
Sorry, I'm playing with the thing here. I shouldn't. Oh, now I've broken it. There we go. So this is a pie chart that we've discussed before. This is our current general fund revenue and general fund expenditure budget. The first thing I just want to always point out on the chart on the right regarding expenditures, police, fire, public works, those comprise about 70% of our expenditures. And that's really where the personnel, materials, contractual services, that's where those costs come from. Other functions of our general fund include financing, our administration, HR, IT, and various other city hall departments. Our revenues on the left side, primarily funded with sales tax revenues, both the home rule and the municipal at 45%, as well as some of our other consumption-based taxes, such as hotel tax, alcohol taxes, and other taxes. So really, roughly, over 50% of our revenues in our general fund come from consumption-based taxes, and that's part of the reason why we talk about wanting to maintain structural balance, because those tax revenue sources do fluctuate with changes in the economy. So having revenue sources that are not subject to those economic fluctuations helps us maintain that structural balance better going forward in the long term. So I want to highlight just some of our general fund revenues and kind of give an update on what some of those trends have been like the last several months. The primary revenue source for our general fund is our 1% sales tax. It comprises roughly 29% of all revenues in the general fund, roughly $18.5 million. Revenues to date are roughly 4.5% higher than last year, so we've had some good overall increases in our sales tax revenue in this current fiscal year. That's consistent with the overall positive economic conditions that we're seeing out there. That takes into account and factors out that one-time January 2024 adjustment we received, that lump sum revenue from the Illinois Department of Revenue. And based on kind of discussions having internally looking forward, we think recent and future business openings are going to have some positive impact overall on the trends going forward. The other major revenue source is our home rule sales tax. This is the 1% that stayed in the general fund, not the increase that was done back in 2023. As a reminder, this revenue source does not apply to food, drugs, or titled vehicles. All those things are excluded from this home rule sales tax. So roughly half of all the taxable transactions are subjected to this tax within the city. That kind of gives you an idea of the volume of taxable sales that's applicable only to that municipal 1%. Revenues on hire so far are roughly 5.5% more than last year, year to date. And overall, we've seen sales taxes continue to be a positive driver with the city's fiscal picture. This chart just shows the increase that's dedicated to the capital fund for roads and infrastructure. We only have about 16 months worth of information on this going forward, but we have seen that increase from the original $4.4 million we estimated. We budgeted $4.8 million this year, and we're on track to receive probably about $4.7 million in the current fiscal year. So this kind of summarizes, a total dollar perspective, the sales tax revenue in the general fund. If we take into account we had those one-time revenue sources in the prior year, we're still looking at a 2.6% increase and a 0.6% increase on our sales tax revenue for the current fiscal year. We're expecting moderate increases next year prior to any sales tax rebates that we need to take into account. One thing to note is that the sales tax revenue bonds related to the construction of the Costco, those were final payment of that was made in January of 2025. So part of that benefit was recognized in the current fiscal year, and the full effect of that will be recognized next fiscal year. The state did pass that legislation eliminating the grocery tax of 1%. That takes into effect January 1st of 2026. That is something that we are discounting and taking into account as we work through these final revenue estimates, and it's something that we'll be revisiting later this calendar year in terms of what impact that would have on the city's budget going forward. Overall, for the current fiscal year, we're very close to what we had budgeted, roughly 0.5% less for the 1% municipal, but 1% higher on the 1% home rule. Those are still under fluctuation, so those could change, but that's kind of our best estimate at this point in time. So I just want to pause for a second if there's any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Director Piano?
Okay.
No? Okay, thank you.
Thanks. State shared income tax revenue, also known as LGDF, is another significant revenue source for the city. Roughly almost $6 million upcoming for next fiscal year. This is based on the per capita basis, so based on the city's official population. It's roughly 9% of our general fund revenue. We were seeing some pretty significant increases in this revenue source several years back, but that's leveled off as corporate income tax and individual income tax receipts have leveled off that are received by the state. For the first 9 months of the fiscal year, revenue is about 5.7% more than last year, and our tentative budget at this point is $5.9 million. Again, we're going to fine-tune that and tweak it based on some additional data that comes in, but that's the number we're looking at right now for next year's budget. And as a reminder, the amounts that are distributed into the local government distributive fund, known as LGDF, come from the allocation of roughly 6% of all income tax revenue received by the state that's distributed to municipalities. So I went through a lot of stuff there. Is any questions on that? Okay. Just wanted to hit the highlights on a few of our other general fund revenue sources. We've seen continued increases in alcohol tax revenue, and based on the trends, we think that's going to continue into next fiscal year, going from $1.96 million last year to roughly $2 million in the current year, and our rough estimate at this point is $2.1 million. State use tax revenue, that's decreased a little bit over the last couple of years. That's because the state changed the law where out-of-state retailers pay directly to municipalities the taxes that are due, rather than the state use tax fund that's distributed on a per capita basis. So we had increase in one revenue source on the sales tax side, but decrease on the use tax revenue that we received from the state. Our hotel tax revenue has been up significantly over the last 6 to 8 months. We're estimating hotel tax revenue right now to be about $2,050,000. That's an increase from the $1.73 million that we received in the prior year. We've had conversations internally. It sounds like those trends are sustainable, so right now we're estimating $2.1 million for next fiscal year. Other revenue sources are local fuel tax, investment income, and building permits. Again, we've got some tentative projections in there at this point, but we're still in the process of evaluating those to come up with a firm, good projection for next year. So we're working on coming up with year-end projections on the expense side for the city's general fund over the next month. As we've kind of alluded to a little bit, revenues seem to be overall in line with our estimates from when we originally made them about a year ago. We're not seeing any extremely significant positive variances as with prior years when we were able to identify some additional monies that we could put towards certain capital projects. We are expecting our expenditures to be under budget slightly due to staff vacancies, projects, the timing of projects getting done, and budgets just not needing to be spent. So we are likely going to have a positive variance for the general fund, but at this point in time, we're still working on what that might be. In past discussions, we've had recommendations for making additional transfers. At this point in time, we are not in a position to recommend any additional transfers out of the general fund to fund certain projects. We are transferring right now additional $1 million to the water fund. That's after we transferred $2.6 million in the prior year to help fund some of those critical water projects that we talked about. As a matter of budgeting, we've been trying to also set aside an additional $1.2 million for capital projects on an annual basis, and then possibly increase that going forward later in the year if we're able to do that. Once we're able to work through some of these projections, we'll have a better idea of where we're at and if that's something we'll be able to do or not. We are not making any recommendations at this time for any additional city contributions for fire and police pension funding. I know we had a discussion last year and we wound up making an additional $1.3 million in contributions. Again, I think that was a good discussion and we were very pleased we were able to do that. Given some of the capital project funding concerns that we have right now, that's not something we're in a position to recommend, but it's something we're going to keep evaluating as we go forward.
And just to emphasize the point that I made earlier, that because of the number of projects that we use and sort of use some of our reserves to fund those projects rather than actual revenues that were coming online, that is why we're not really in a position to continue to do that same thing. We've drawn those down just about to where we can comfortably, keeping our reserve levels where they need to be. So again, we'll see in a few slides about the number of projects that we have ongoing, especially in our utility funds, that we're not talking about projects that are $5 and $10 million. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure needs that the city is going to have to find a solution for. So at this time, it makes most logical sense to hold off on any of those discretionary transfers. We are still meeting our pension obligations and the operational obligations we have. We are just not recommending funding them through additional reserves at this point.
Just to recap on the city's bond rating, there's a couple of slides that we've had in here every year since 23. So the city does maintain an AA1 bond rating. That's the second highest rating that Moody's assigns. Moody's did change their rating methodology in 23. That's why we initially brought this up for discussion, but just wanted to bring it up as a reminder that they're taking a much more entity-wide look at a city or governmental entity's finances in terms of evaluating what kind of rating they should have. They're not looking just at a general fund or a debt service fund. They're looking at all the enterprise funds and everything on an entity-wide basis. They also give more emphasis to what your long-term liabilities are and a little bit less to what your institutional framework might be like. And I won't go into these, but this just kind of gives some of the criteria and how they weight those criteria in terms of scorecard factors. There's various factors for the economy, financial performance, your liquidity ratios, fund balance ratios, what is your institutional framework, and increased emphasis on your long-term liabilities ratios and your fixed asset, fixed cost ratios as well. So just wanted to put that out as just a reminder as to what Moody's looks at when they go through the annual process of evaluating the city's financial condition. On the topic of Moody's and general obligation debt, this is the chart of general obligation debt outstanding beginning in 23. So the third column from the left is the fiscal year we are currently in. That would be the total general obligation outstanding debt of the city as of April 30th, 2025. That is at the $88,465,000 level coming up here at April. We have increased the amount of IEPA loans outstanding for water and sewer projects, but those are issued at least at a lower rate than what general obligation bonding would be at this point. Next couple slides, want to shift gears a little bit and talk about personnel cost, wage adjustments, and staffing adjustments for next fiscal year. So the total FTEs planned to provide services to the city for next year are planned for 285.2. This is basically an adjustment of 2 full-time people in water and sewer. If you recall, last year we talked about the need to increase operational staffing in water and environmental services due to increased maintenance of the current water system, increased testing responsibilities of the certified water operators, and increased customer service needs that residents are demanding from the department. So this is really a continuation of that original discussion from the prior year. There was 4 original requested, so we did 2 last year, and the other 2 would be in this current upcoming fiscal year. Other than that, there was really just some minor changes in part-time hours or a conversion of a part-time position to a full-time position in certain departments. Things that happen when, typically people leave and a position is reevaluated and the needs assessed if it needs to be continue to be part-time or full-time. So total planned FTEs are still about the same as 2012 at around 285.
And just to emphasize that additional staffing in the water and sewer operations, public works in particular, is something that's really susceptible to infrastructure needs. So as we are not investing the money into replacements of water mains, that is really a huge driver in those operational needs for staffing in that department, because we are getting tapped out at our overtime and the actual employee base that we already have, because we're spending so much time fixing those water main breaks versus replacing and getting something that's not subject to so many breaks. Our water main breaks themselves have been increasing pretty significantly, and we're going to have to continue to look at that until our system gets to a point that we no longer have to dedicate those kind of needs towards our operational side.
So a summary on wage adjustments effective May 1st. As you know, the city has 5 collective bargaining agreements with 5 different units. Those all have contracts in place for next fiscal year, and now Jen is very happy about that, as well as several other directors. The annual wage adjustments associated with the upcoming year for those contracts are listed here for the various units. In addition, there are typically step increases with those contracts, roughly 4% to 8%, until the maximum amount is reached for a certain position within a CBA. The recommended non-union wage adjustments, so there's a lot of research and surveys that go into coming up with recommendations based on what's happening in the market and the need of the city to attract and retain workforce. So the recommended adjustments on market for next year are 3.5% and 3% for the merit increase pool. Just a reminder for context, personnel costs are roughly $57 million a year, or roughly 25% of the city's total budget. When you're looking at just the city's general operating fund, it's $41 million, or roughly 60%. So personnel costs are the biggest driver in terms of providing services to the city, and it's one of the things that we try and come up with ways to manage, but also try and identify ways to keep the appropriate workforce funded to provide the high level of services for the community. Jen, is there anything else you wanted to add, or did I summarize that? I didn't misspeak, did I? Okay, thanks. Quick summary on our TIF districts. The city had 8 TIF districts in total. We just retired our 4th TIF district, TIF 3, that was terminated just this last calendar year. In fact, we recently were able to finalize the return of the surplus money that was accumulated in the TIF district to the county, and they will disperse that to the taxing bodies on a pro rata basis. That final distribution was just over $824,000. We did, as mentioned earlier, have the TIF 4 First Street extended, so that levy year and last year for increment will be extended out to 2037 and then 2038, 2039. And this last calendar year, 23 levy collected in 24 was the first year that we received increment for the Pheasant Run TIF district, and that amount was $328,000. As we get moving forward further in the budget process, we'll come up with estimates for what we think the the remaining TIF districts will generate as far as TIF increment, but typically we don't get final numbers until April, so we're kind of using our best estimates at that point. Any questions on TIF districts? Okay. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was capital projects. So we go through a lot of different capital planning processes and discussions. These can come from master planning processes and various other things. And so we have an evolving projection of what these capital needs, requirements, mandates, or wants might be. And I don't want to get too hung up on one specific number. I just kind of wanted to illustrate in total the different categories just so you had a little bit of perspective. The first line is general capital needs. So that's our roads, storm sewers, facility improvements, any department-specific items related to perhaps fire or police facilities, any bike or pet improvements that have been identified as desirable to look into. Those will get lumped into that first level. And typically those would be funded with those general capital revenues that we've talked about before. And I'll summarize what those are on the next slide. Our electric fund, that's really on a capital maintenance level at this point. A lot of those projects are to maintain and upgrade or update the existing infrastructure. Water and sewer is where we have a significant amount of capital projects over the next, several years, and then some possibly larger dollar amounts beyond the next 4 years. And we'll touch on those a little bit more, but those are related to new well development, water main replacement, lead service lines, treatment plant expansion capacity improvements, and sewer main line improvements. So those are things that have been talked about in the past, and we're just kind of giving a visual for what those look like when you're laying it out over a multi-year period. For a little bit more context, roughly 80%, 85% of our water and sewer funds dedicated revenues and user charges are dedicated to operations and debt service. So that doesn't leave a lot of additional monies on an annual basis for cash-funded capital projects. So that's kind of the challenge that we've had when we're looking at these things on an annual basis. Kind of given those constraints, I just wrote down some of the different considerations that, we talk about internally when we're dealing with a lot of different capital projects. What are the needs? Is it a replacement versus new? What are the costs and what are the benefits of those projects? Do we have an opportunity to leverage grant resources? If so, what does that do to the timeline of a certain project? What's the operational impact? If we do this, do we have to incur a significant increase in operational costs on an annual basis? And finally, how do we determine priorities and evaluate what funds we have available? So that's kind of just a sampling of some of the things that go through our mind when we're trying to look at capital funding and prioritize and collectively, what we all are trying to the best plan to figure out. So just on those capital funding sources, roughly $6.5 to $7.5 million a year is what we have in that capital fund, and that's derived from our $4.8 million in sales tax revenues, video gaming tax revenues, investment income, and then other sources or transfers of revenues that we may be able to identify. If we had surplus funds because we were closing a fund or revenues were higher than normal, we might be able to leverage that and get some additional dollars into capital projects. Grants contributions, that's always something the city is looking into, and that's really obviously dependent on the project. So as a general ballpark, we're looking at a roughly $6.5, $7.5 million in total capital funding sources a year compared to the general outlay on average of roughly, say, 8, 9, 10 million in capital needs that the previous slide was looking at as far as general capital projects.
Bill, would you mind going back one slide now?
Sure.
So with that understanding that we have, that $6.5 to $7.5 million range to fund our capital projects every year, this is where we as a staff, when we try to do things like strategic drawdown and reserves, can make that work. And that's what I mean in a single year, in a single project, when we have these smaller projects that are $1 million or $2 million, it's easier to make that work as a single event. But when you look comprehensively at the total dollars that we have yearly and over the course of even these 5 years, and I don't want to get stuck on the specific projects right now as opposed to just the general trends. When we are making the recommendations or when we have a rate study that needs to fund these, there isn't a way to make up that revenue in alternate ways, absent some large grant funding source that comes along in a single year. So it's important that we recommend that we make concrete steps to get to those points year after year and make sure that we are actually being able to fund some of these necessary improvements, because these are things that are not going away and continue to build on those out years. And at some point, we're not going to be able to bond out. We can't just use that as a fallback, because as our debt gets higher, we are not going to meet the debt coverage ratios that we're going to need to have those bonds. And the only option we are going to have is to make sure that we have a revenue source coming in to fund those improvements. And especially in something like water, sewer, electric, it's important that those funds are self-sustaining for these exact reasons. There just isn't enough revenue to create for an $89 million project in 5 years out. So I just want council to kind of understand that. And I think maybe this chart with these total dollar amounts on it helps to understand a little bit what we're looking at as a year-to-year basis when we're trying to recommend some of these projects. And something in the sewer fund, for example, where we know we've got the east side trunk main that we're going to need to complete, eventually we are going to get to a point where we cannot continue to sustain economic development on the east side without those improvements. So when we don't have the dollars to fund that, and then we don't have any new business coming in to help fund other revenue sources, we're going to get stagnant and not be able to continue our development. So it's important when we look at these things comprehensively, we understand where there are available resources and where there are not available resources.
Moving on to kind of an outlay of what some of those specific capital projects are that are being looked at. And again, a lot of this will be ultimately dependent on the big picture of funding and trying to see what we can fit in the budget for next year. But this would kind of give you an idea of what's being kind of talked about right now. Just want to touch on a couple IS projects that were completed, the PEP process, GIS migration, as well as our North Star utility billing system. For the upcoming year, IS is looking at replacements to the city's voice over IP system, video management system, and as well as continuing the GIS migration project that has begun. That's a 3-year cost estimate there, and right now there's an estimate of $130,000 for next fiscal year. Going out further than that, improvements to the city's digital meeting management system, kind of continuing some of the processes that were begun earlier. ERP system replacement for finance HR, that could be a high dollar number. That's probably on the high end side, but that could take place anytime in the next 2 to 3, 4 years. And document management conversion and converting some of those with our Laserfish system, a project that may begin to be necessary in 2026. So I just want to pause a minute, and I guess, Larry, if you have anything you want to add or any questions. Switching a little bit to infrastructure, just want to make a list of the things that have been accomplished or are about to be accomplished in the current fiscal year. We already talked about the road program. That was roughly 13 miles. Alley resurfacing, that was something identified last year, and that process has begun, and several alleys were completed in the current fiscal year. The Piano Factory Bridge analysis design, that was initiated in the current year. And the 7th Avenue Creek project at 25 and more, that is also scheduled to be mostly done in the current fiscal year. There's several facility items there that were also accomplished. The Police Tactical Training Center was completed with grant funding. The Council Chamber and Conference Room design project, that was designed and bid, and that project is under further evaluation. So upcoming next fiscal year, this is a beginning a list of some of the things being discussed. We have our 2025 road program. That's to be roughly 13 miles at roughly $8.4 million. One thing that we've been talking about internally is utility work. This is water sewer work associated with the annual road program. That is something that I don't know that we can fund with our water and sewer funds that we typically do. So we are looking at possibly funding the utility work associated with the road program out of the capital fund. So that would be a shift in how we've been able to do things in the past. Piano factory design process, that $542,000, that is to complete phase 1 and begin phase 2 of that design project. The signal intersection project also scheduled to be done next fiscal year. And see various other smaller dollar projects except for State Street Creek. Again, that's a project involving multiple storm, water, and sewer utilities, and this would be the capital fund portion of that project. Pause for a second. Any questions? This is a proposed map of the 2025 street program. Street segments on here I think can be picked up. The Smith Road, Pheasant Run Trails, Persimmon, Fox Chase Boulevard, and several streets and segments on the west side as well. This is subject to change based on funding and how the bids come back in, so there could be changes to this design, but Public Works was comfortable showing the proposed outline of what the program looks like for next year. Continuing projects under discussion for next fiscal year, again, dependent on funding. We have a couple of roof projects, a couple more roof projects with the East Salt Dome and the what we call the IDOT Annex facility over on the east side. Repairs, maintenance improvements at First Street Parking Garage. We have our sidewalk gap program, some maintenance activities for City Hall offices, typically carpet and paint. One project that's been discussed, the parking garage counters over on First Street. That's a possible cost estimate for what those might be. Mid-block path crossing at Illinois Street, and some site work and drainage improvements over at the History Museum site. I'll pause for a second. Any questions on these? So looking at future years, this kind of gives, over the next probably 3 to 4 years, some other items that are out there. Obviously continuing our annual road program, and I think as we talked about, using capital funds to fund the water and sewer portions of that road program will probably, at this point, be necessary, but that could impact the future total scope of the program going forward. These are some various bike and ped improvements that have been identified as possibly having a possible time to get completed between 2026 and 2030, again, dependent upon funding and depending on any grants that may be out there that may be eligible for some of these. There's several culvert replacement projects associated with the 7th Avenue Creek improvements to improve storm drainage. They typically cost between $1.4 and $3.5 million. One possible plan would be to do these every other year, but again, that's really dependent on available funds. A couple other projects too out there are possible Piano Factory Bridge improvements, whatever that possible option looks like, and the improvement to the Red Gate Bridge and those railings, and that possible cost option for that. I went through a lot of things there.
Excuse me, I think
Yep.
Alderman Rebel.
Yes.
Could you speak to Kirk and Route 64 crossings? Is that going to be in the budget in March, or is this just a talking point at this point?
I was just going to say, those ones are just future identified in the next handful of years. It's something that we're going to be working on doing design and engineering on. The county has tentatively agreed to participate in the cost sharing of that, and there's some potential that IDOT can participate in the cost sharing as well, provided that the project's ready to go. So we're working on getting that portion of it ready so that when there's an opportunity for that project to be funded, we're ready to go. But it is not in the budget for construction for next year.
Right. Yeah, to clarify, these are kind of in the out years for discussion. So brief update on water and sewer capital projects. This is a slide that has been before you before. This kind of recaps some of the major projects that have been done over the last several years and the various funding sources associated with those projects and planning processes that went into those. Looking forward, this is a summary of the more critical, high-dollar water and sewer projects that are out there. We'll touch on the next slide, the water well A capacity expansion and treatment project. We are looking at moving through the IEP loan process for that so that that capacity expansion project can move forward. There's an additional well that may be needed in the future based on projections, PE, and development. For various reasons, that could be a significant dollar cost, but that's probably on the higher end. But that is out several years in the future. We've talked about lead service line replacement. That's roughly about $7.6 million a year on an annual basis for 10 years. And water main replacement generally, that really varies. Right now, there's several $1 million of water main replacement that I know Public Works would like to move forward with. So we are trying to see what the funding looks like, but it's likely that a lot of that might have to get deferred going forward. On the sewer side, we completed the phase 1 of the East Side Sanitary Sewer Trunk Main project with ARPA funds back in 2021, 2022. The next 2 phases of that project are roughly $39 million. And it has some other sanitary sewer treatment plant capacity expansion dollars associated with some of those improvements going forward. One of the things we talked about last year was that we were looking at doing a utility rate study after the utility master plans were completed. They are near completion, so we are in the process of looking at an RFP to issue and move forward with the study over the summer. And as I previously mentioned, we are looking at needing to defer some water main replacement and other projects that were slated at least a year.
And maybe the reference to the lead service lines is a good point to talk about the fact that, you know, a year ago we thought we were going to have 30 years to do lead service lines, and now they've updated that to require us to do it in 10 years. So these are some of the things that, as a local government, especially ones with a utility, that we are subject to have to evaluate on a year-by-year basis and then come up with an additional $5, $8, $10, $20 million. All of a sudden it happens regularly with contaminants and different treatment processes that we need for the water treatment plant as well. So right now we have a list of projected projects that are pretty extensive and pretty costly, but that does not curtail the possibility of another project that's equally expensive coming down the pipeline in another year. So I'm just taking it as an opportunity to, again, emphasize the importance of keeping pace with the projects that we know we have to do, because ultimately we will have to do these, and we are also trying to avoid a situation in which there is an even more significant impact to the residents all at once, because we no longer have the capability to figure out alternative funding sources for these projects.
So one of the first projects on that list was the well A capacity and treatment. This would add additional capacity for the city's water pumping and treatment capabilities. As indicated, this project would involve drilling a new deep well, running transmission main to the existing treatment plant, as well as several modifications to the building. We are pursuing IEP loan funding for this project. We anticipate annual debt service related to that of roughly $1 million per year. But we're comfortable moving forward with that project given the previously approved rate increase capacity and projections for the next several years with those rate adjustments. So we will see some additional items come before council as that process moves forward. This is that future well we were talking about earlier. City is exploring potential sites at this time. There's no dedicated funding sources, but this is a project that will be probably 3 to 4 years out at this point. We may be eligible for a loan at that point, but it really depends on as we get closer to identifying what that looks like. Pete and his team have talked about lead service lines many times, so Just reiterating, bringing out the slide they provided to you previously. Again, with the change in the mandates, we're looking at estimated cost of $7.5 million as an indicative cost on an annual basis for 10 years. And this is something that we're going to have further discussion on later this year on funding options for this in the future. The last project just want to touch on is the East Side Sanitary Sewer Trunk Main. The city is looking to move forward with one section of what we see as Phase 2 on that map. We also call it Phase 2B. That cost of that project is roughly $7 to $10 million. Given the current sewer rate capacity, we are looking at internally trying to finance that project via internal fund loaned from one fund to another to try and get that project going and keep that moving forward. But that's something we're still evaluating, and we would bring further discussion on that once we had a chance to evaluate what that looks like. So that's the end of the updates that we wanted to provide you in terms of revenues, capital, and personnel adjustments for the budget process. Happy to take any questions and follow-up.
Director Hannah, thank you very much for that very thorough explanation. I will take questions, but I didn't know if the city administrator has anything to add before we go into questions.
I think just very briefly, our intent tonight was not to be doom and gloom, but it is to emphasize the reality of the number of projects that are mandated and that are necessary for keeping our residents with functioning utilities, functioning roadways, and all of the other things that we as a city provide service for. So we've done an excellent job getting our debt down $20 million over the last couple of years. That's been a really crucial part so that frees up some ability for us to bond out as we do need to do those things. But the important factor is making sure that we are planning strategically to make sure that we have the funds on hand where available to keep pace with those improvements, because we do have to keep doing that. This is an older city. Those type of improvements are always going to be necessary, and that's the course that we're looking at guiding towards and making sure that we're able to complete those projects without any major catastrophic events.
I'll start to my right if there are any comments or questions from my right. Okay, left? Yes, Alderman Petrella.
Bill, or actually more probably for Peter, that the East Side Sanitary Sewer, that map I think it's on the last picture or slide right before this one. Is that the entire east side of the city, or is it primarily like the industrial park? Just curious. Like where's that? Is that collecting from the entire east side?
That's on or not. It's not the entire east side. On the sanitary side, the systems are broken down into what we call basins, and this is a really large basin. Some of them are small, some of them are large. So this really, has the Couch Road area, the Pheasant Run property, the mall property, all of the industrial area. And it goes all the way back to 7th Avenue, or the Public Works facility.
Got it. And we're going to talk internally about funding opportunities moving forward, because it says here option to internally finance part of Phase 2. We're going to have further.
That's what Bill mentioned about a potential inter-fund loan from one of our other funds to do that. And maybe a different perspective on that too is there are a number of places that can develop on the east side that this improvement will trigger. And any single one may not trigger it, but eventually it's going to get to the point that it will be triggered. And what we are trying to avoid is a situation in which we have all of the smaller pieces infill, and then when a Charlestown Mall or when a Pheasant Run develops into something major, that we have the capacity available to take those on. Otherwise, it is going to be a couple-year project, and that is going to limit what we can develop at that point.
Alderman Bongard,
can you, Bill, I don't know which slide it was, but can you go back to the annual general fund expenditure year over year? Was that one of the charts? Did I miss that?
I don't think we had a multi-year general fund year over year.
That's a good thing. I have it right here. So when you look at, 21, 22, 22, 23, 23, 24, obviously that general fund number is climbing, and it's not climbing. It's climbing because of paying down our debt, investing in our infrastructure, and just general operating costs. So when you look at this presentation of the amount of things that requires to do, not that we want to do, well, there are some wants in here, but things that we have to do from an infrastructure standpoint. When we get into conversations like the property tax levy and some of these other, I don't want this body to seem like every time it comes into a funding request that it's going to turn into, nickel and diming what we want to pay and 1% and 0.5%, at the same time recognizing that this group has a responsibility to residents of not feeling like, well, we always have to go back and find the funding. But how do you think that we are on a good trajectory of being able to meet all the needs that this city has from an infrastructure standpoint, given financially, each of the last 4 years of meeting those, basically being able to juggle that? Like, can your budget and how we're taking money be able to sustain this?
Yeah, I think you mentioned two good points there. One, how do we continue to fund operating services and providing services to the city residents? I think that is something that we look at annually, and that involves personnel, that involves contractual services, that involves commodities, in terms of providing those services out of the general fund. Mm-hmm. From a capital standpoint, I think we have a topic that we mentioned tonight in terms of priorities, in capital projects. And, in terms of we need to determine what those priorities are so that we can choose which projects go forward, but that means that some projects will not advance or not advance as quickly as we may like. And I think that was one of the things that Heather was trying to articulate, was that we have very limited resources to try and do everything we want to do, and we need to have a conversation about the costs and the benefits of certain capital projects, the opportunity for grant funding, and what's, being able to prioritize the most critical ones that we need to do, or find additional resources to get those done.
And I think another piece of that too is also our long-term debt management strategies. One of the first things that I know I started talking to council about when I was hired is making sure that we are getting our debt down so that we can strategically bond out where necessary and where appropriate, as opposed to dedicating a large source of our funding every year towards our debt service obligations, because you're paying interest on top of the original capital that we got for that project. So being able to make sure that we're looking at this comprehensively, not as a year over year, but as a long-term management strategy, so that we are funding our projects as necessary. Once that debt gets to a manageable point where it's paid down, then we can start having a different conversation and looking critically every single year at, okay, what projects do we need to do as we're on track, and making sure that we're minimizing the impact either on the property taxes or the utility rates.
Yeah, so, and I think we've made this comment in the past, the concerns that I've had, and I think we all share this, I think everybody in this room does, right, is the size of the pie increasing every single year is going to things that we want to invest in. We want to, have better roads, lead pipe replacement, you can go down the line, debt for financing, pensions, et cetera. At the same time, recognizing, though, as much as we want to get to all of those things, the reality is it just becomes, so what is the best process? Because at some point, this body's going to have to start making some decisions of prioritizing, like, you know what? Maybe that's something we just can't get to. You're going to have to find a new funding source for it, because you look at just the ask that falls on a municipality like this, and finding, additional revenue sources sounds like a path I'm not interested in going down, but the pie keeps getting bigger because we have all these things that we have to do. And how do we get to a point where we have to start deciding, you know what, here's your A and B that we can prioritize, but everything else, as much as I'd love to get to that, can't happen. Otherwise, we're going to have a general fund operating of $95 million, and that just becomes, and I'm just throwing that number out there. But that becomes really tough. We're not going to triple our size. So
before Bill jumps in too, I just want to emphasize that a lot of the time municipalities are expected to operate like a business, but not operate like a business. And we are subject to inflation the same way everybody else is. Each year it costs us more to buy the things that we need to complete those operational services. So we are subject to those same increases the way that any other business is, but we are mandated to provide certain things as well. So it's not as simple to just cut things out. So when you ask your question, I would maybe suggest looking at those as two different components, which is one, our enterprise funds versus our actual general fund. As we talked about, $6.5 to $7.5 million of discretionary funding in our general fund, those are the discretionary projects that we really have versus some of the things in our utility funds that we absolutely have to tackle.
Right, and wouldn't it potentially be more appropriate to take that 6 or 7 million and repurpose it to those other things because that's the more prudent thing to do for the next 5, 10 years so that you don't say, hey, as much as I'd love to redo this room, the reality is repurposing some of those funds elsewhere because, you know, you've got 50-year road replacement that really could use more help.
Sure, I definitely think that's one strategy, but I just would caution you at service levels for St. Charles and community expectations and the things that draw people to both live here and open businesses here. That's part of what those capital needs are that we spend every year that continue to make this a thriving city, and by completely eliminating those, you're going to eliminate some of that draw as well.
Alderman Lencioni, did you have something?
Yes, I do, absolutely. Thank you, Bill. Absolutely terrific, eye-opening presentation. One of my first questions that I have was some of the large capital projects, and if you take a look where you have question marks when you're talking about additional potable water wells and things like that, you got $50-ish million. One of the things that I'd like to see in that, and I'm thinking about this more now, is what's the schedule? When do you start, and how long does the benefit lead? Because when we're taking a look like this, with that, I'd also love to see what's the capital structure for doing some of those? Because obviously, like, we're adding capacity. You know, understand, is that replacement? Is that additional capacity? And how do we think about what's the annualized cost? Because you get the big ticket. This is how much it's going to cost. How long will it last? How do we match, you know, the service of those wells to kind of when we're going to tax, you know, when we have to find revenue, when those tax dollars need to be applied, because that'll give a little bit of context. But I really appreciated seeing that, because I think that we need to think about that. We've had discussions about how do we match, you know, how do we make sure that we're taxing today's residents, not for benefit that we're going to get in 30 years, and understand if we're catching up or, you know, 40 years behind. Because there are times where we're behind and we're like, we should have been paying this. And the residents today, for the next 5 years, are going to be paying for things that we should have been paying for in the next 30 years, and understand how we got there. But then also say, these are things that are going to benefit for us, you know, and we're going to get benefit 50 years in advance. So how do we schedule to make sure that we're matching revenues to when the benefit is provided? That's part one. I'll answer that, and then I got to follow up with that. Does that make sense? I would love to see a schedule, like how the capital structure is going to be as far as, like, is this a 20-year asset? And what kind of a bond horizon would we be looking at to do some of these things? Maybe you don't have an answer right now, but that's the thing that I would love to see, because it helps me get
Sure. It's a balancing act between, you know, taking your resources that you have for capital projects and deciding this is going to be what we use on an annual basis, and this amount we're going to set aside for future debt or loan repayment. Right? So there's a balancing act between those two things, and that's one of the things we talk about internally, is how do we achieve that right balance, and how do we do the things that we need to do on an annual basis without going to bond or debt or loan for those types of things. That's really, when you have things that you have to do on an annual basis, whether it's operations or capital, it's essentially an operational expense, because something you need to do every single year, even though it is a capital improvement.
And to understand, and you get what I'm saying, transition that big number into what is the annualized cost, you know, and how's that going forward. But that's, I mean, I'm looking across the room and I'm seeing blinking eyes as you and I are having this conversation too. And that goes to the point too, is this is terrific, but, you know, I'm going to bring up that we did over the, probably, you know, in the fall, we need to have quarterly, like, talk about these things quarterly, so we can better understand this, so we also can put on our schedules, you know, make sure that we have the background to understand what we're going to be talking about, because, you know, there are times when we start talking about what's in front of us right now, and we just say, hey, does this work? Because we need to have every resource possible to make sure that we can kind of keep finances in our head, so it's an ongoing conversation. And we all know that I've said this before, but I'm going to make the point again. You know, so we can make those good decisions, it has to be quarterly. Like, we have to see things that look like this and continue to work at, like, what those trade-offs are, because sometimes something will come before us and we lose, you know, it's too easy to lose sight of the fact that, you know, we have, you know, additional wells that are going to be $50,000, you know, or $50 million, excuse me. My brain doesn't even like thinking about it, you know, and to help us understand how all of these needs, you know, fit into the current you know, our current ideas of how much money that we have, how it's gonna go forward. I mean, it's just, I mean, even talking about it, and I'm a finance professional, it's hard. And so with all of this, good job. I would like to see those time horizons on the investment. We really do have to have something quarterly that helps so we can do our homework and do a better job. We have a lot of responsibility coming up, and if we're gonna do well, we need that help.
Alderman Werthal.
Okay. So I'm looking at the infrastructure piece, so it looks like some of it is obviously due to age. We don't have control over that, right? It's old, it needs to be replaced. Some of it's unfunded mandates we have to address, and those are tough decisions that we have to pay for some way, and that hopefully you can figure something out that's reasonable. And then the third thing is developments. When we bring developments here to the city that perhaps are not appropriate, that are at the expense of taxpayers. And my question is, when we consider future developments, can we also consider maybe perhaps making sure that they are appropriate for zoning, that they maybe are somehow assisted on behalf of the developer? And I'll give an example. Prairie Street is torn up. I remember when Prairie Street Apartments was under consideration way back 7 years ago. And it's zoned for 450 apartments, and it ends up getting built to 680 apartments. And I remember looking and listening and reading the reports for the sewers that they were already at capacity, and we are now paying to fix all that and upgrade it at our expense. So it's really a subsidy to the developer. So I get it. We want to do things, some of the unfunded mandates, the aging pipes, those are things we don't really have much of a choice on that we have to address. But I would just like to think about when we do developments that if we're going to go beyond what zoning allows, then there needs to be consideration that the developer needs to help out and assist with those infrastructure upgrades. That's just my point on that. So.
You mentioned zoning. I thought I was going to get a chance to sit down, so thank you for that. Yeah, I think cost of development, that's a big discussion, and I think you can touch on impact fees and various other things. So it's a good conversation for down the road.
And I do want to emphasize, since Derek's been here, I know we usually do a pretty thorough evaluation on each project. We look at the pro forma, we look at the net cost to us and make sure that it is a positive contribution ultimately, but those are things that absolutely that we should be looking at and taking into consideration when we're approving any redevelopment agreements.
Alderman Besser.
Thank you. Bill, thank you for your presentation. Just a couple of quick questions, and I think I might be speaking in the world of Councilman Bongard down there regarding the general fund.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know right now what our percentage of reserves is? Approximately. I know 25% is the threshold.
Fine. It was around 46.1% with the strategic drawdown we did last year. It's roughly about 40.1% was the last number.
Which is still a nice number to have for reserve funds. Now, the reason why I brought that up is because in the past, I've been an advocate for keeping that number to where it is. And with you being in your position now for almost 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, do you see where that threshold should be? Meaning, should we be floating more around the, 30% mark or 32% mark, meaning we're not just sitting on funds, sitting on money, so to say, but we also have enough for a rainy day?
Sure. There's a lot of things that go into what your fund balance target should be, what your revenue mix is in your general fund, what your outstanding capital projects are, how are you funding your capital projects. There's a lot of considerations. I'm happy with where we're at right now. Do I think there's maybe a little wiggle room to use a little bit? But maybe. But we have to be mindful too that as our expenditures and cost of operations increase, that fund balance threshold will decrease if the dollar amount is kept the same.
Sure.
So, taking into account some of those things, I think there's a healthy discussion there, but I'm also happy where it is right now.
Gotcha. And then going back to what City Administrator Heather was talking about in regards to kind of just not going into the habit of pinpricking projects out of there.
Yeah.
Is there another source of projects or development, should I say, that we should support where we get revenue back in return for it? Something where it's going to create either growth or improvement for growth et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
I mean, I guess the question is, can we, should we, or do we do that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, I think, and Derek would be happy to address some of that.
And it may not be quite as one-to-one on the development that's going to bring in, certainly they're going to bring in sales tax, potentially alcohol tax, potentially other improvements, but I think where we really would be best focused is our revenue sources and those being sustainable and knowing that we can predict those year over year. So yes, absolutely bringing in development is always a positive contribution for various reasons, whether that's residential or commercial, but the revenue sources, whether that's through, sales tax increase like we did several years ago or some other revenue source is usually the better way to go. Okay. And if I can go back really quickly to your first point about the reserve balance between 45% and 25%. I think last year when we looked at that, I just want to make sure on record that everybody understands we're talking about the difference between like $5 and $10 million. Right. This is not a $200 million balance we're talking about adjusting. It's a pretty small amount of money that's, a single project essentially for us. And then we are at that 25% threshold, which will ultimately affect our bond rating too. They do not like to see you at that very low threshold, but it's not a huge dollar amount either way.
Okay, thank you. And then outside these larger capital water projects that we've been talking about a little bit tonight, the projects that we've kind of been deferring since COVID, quite honestly, I think is where it started. Are those pretty consistent in the wheelhouse, meaning even though we're waiting a year, the next projects are coming, or do we have to go back and decide what's more important because something needs a little bit more attention now? Or is it just pretty consistent?
Anyone here can answer that, but I think one point I will, say is that it's always evolving. I mean, sometimes there are things that are 5 years out and there's an urgency that comes up to bring that forward. And sometimes there's a project that's on the calendar for next year and it's been determined, this is something we can actually wait on. Gotcha. So I think it depends on the project and whatever that specific need is.
And then last question, it's a minor question, but the LGDF with the state, are we in good standing with them? Not so much on our behalf, but are they paying us consistently now? I know a few years back, or even a year or two back, it was like a slow walk, or they were thinking about charging us a processing fee. Are we beyond all that?
I'm not sure if we're beyond the processing fee. I believe there was some state law tweaks to where they could not decide to fall 6 months behind paying us like they were before. Okay. So that is not happening anymore. Great. Yeah. I think everyone knows they're always trying to take another bite at our apple. Yeah. So we'll see what happens as far as that.
And that is something that we continue to go after our legislators about every single year, asking for that increase to get us back to that 10% threshold that we were at 5-6 years ago.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you, Mayor Vitek. Bill, in regards to our the outstanding debt, obviously we have paid it down $20 million. Is there currently any loans that we have that we're only paying the interest on that we're not paying any principal on?
No, I don't believe there's any outstanding bond issues where we're only paying interest.
Our TIF 4 is the bond that the payments will go up in next year, but that is paid directly out of our TIF fund too.
Okay, so right. That was the only one then that had that scenario?
So we are paying a small amount of principal on that. We have been paying a small amount of principal. That payment ramp roughly doubles in a couple of years. Okay. And that was part of the conversation revolving the TIF 4 extension process.
And then in regards to the outstanding debt, obviously, with $88 million, it's still a larger number. What would be a comfortable number that you would like to see to allow us to possibly borrow? Sure.
There's always a good reason to consider bonding on for something. It can be efficient. It can be a cost-effective way of accomplishing something. It's putting yourself in a position so when that opportunity does present itself, you have the ability to do it. But also deciding how you're going to repay that bond issuance, and that's part of what that conversation needs to be as well. So I think, it's something that we can consider in the future, but I think right now, the last couple of years, we've been focused on bringing that down to a more manageable level. Especially, there are thresholds out there, percentage of debt service as it relates to general fund expenditures that you can look at and what that should be, 10% or 15%. So those are some things we've taken a look at as well in determining, do we need to get that overall number down to a much lower level?
And I think when it is at that lower level, that really does free us up to either take on projects that we think will be extremely beneficial to the city or emergency projects that we need to do as well.
Alderperson Munn.
Thank you so much. I know that we've talked about this before, and all the person, Warval has brought it up a number of times, and so have several of the rest of us. I'm curious what kind of planning staff in general have had conversations about regarding looking at the timing of how we do our budgeting season in respect to when we have to decide upon our property tax levy, because it makes it very difficult as electeds for us to make that decision and make a good, balanced decision when we don't have budget information until far later than when we have to make that vote.
I think that's something we can talk about more down the road a little bit. I think that most communities have April 30th fiscal year end. We do maintain forecasting of general fund revenues and expenditures, so those are some things that we can also present and take a look at in terms of, from a structural standpoint, where do we want to be with our budget? You know, we know there are certain cost drivers that we have to fund that are increasing on an annual basis, especially when it comes to personnel and operations. So we know what those things are. There are certain aspects of that operating budget that we know are going to be increasing every year. So in that context, we can take a high-level macro look at that and look from a structural standpoint, you know, where do we need to be to try and keep pace with some of those things? When you're talking about increasing personnel costs, pension costs, you know, cost of goods and services and commodities and contractual services, most of those have been increasing pretty steadily on an annual basis. So it's in that context that we look at, you know, trying to stay structurally sound with things like a property tax levy.
Okay. I would wonder if that would be complemented well by Alderman Moncione's recommendation for doing quarterly finance updates to give us at least a better picture than in that case. But I know that last year we did talk about maybe adjusting the schedule for this too, and kind of received the same answer of looking at that in the future. So I guess I would ask that we get some more clarity around what that actually means for us.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Alderman Bonner?
Well, my colleague just took like 80% of the words out of my mouth. So I as somebody who voted no in committee regarding the property tax levy, because my feeling was that this group was divided, but on a number of questions as to timing, funding, and trying to kick it back to staff so that we could find a greater consensus of where we were going, so we don't have this what I would call a moving target as to, you know, what we're funding, what the timing is, but, you know, it played out the way that it was, and I think the responsible thing to do was to go and fund as you guys recommended. That being said, if this group feels like the timing and the scheduling, because there's two different, I don't want to say debates, but there's two different things, right? Hey, we're going to argue over where's the most appropriate, you know, to put the money, and then how much money are we generating? Are we asking, you know, from the public to fund these things? And you can go back and forth. But what I don't want this group to do is have disagreement about the timing and the scheduling of it, because the other stuff is going to be more than enough of a headache. Because you start getting into budgeting, right, about, you know, unfunded mandates and utilities, like there's tough things that you want to do. But I would love to see, you know, in this timing, whatever this body looks like moving forward, has consensus about the timing and the scheduling as to how we go about doing this. And I know other municipalities do it the way that we do it, so it's not like we're, you know, doing something different, but I feel like at times this group gets off track because of some of those other things, and I'd like us to be able to have more discussions about, well, you know, what do you want to prioritize, as opposed to the timing of some of these things.
Right.
And I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's a good conversation I can talk to Administrator McGuire about, and having, you know, a bigger picture conversation on what that could look like.
I mean, not the, you know, I mean, David and I, the three of us sat down after the committee meeting and had, you know, really good conversations about, you know, funding levels and how things go. And, you know, like ultimately we may not, you know, agree on everything, but making sure that the things that we are talking about are more focused in on some of the asks that these departments have versus some of the scheduling and timing of those things. So
And one of the things that I just want to make sure maybe this is a conversational piece to clarify is what information would help you most effectively make that decision or what you're looking for. And I say that only because we set our tax levy in November for the following year for receipts that we essentially don't receive for another year. So we're already not receiving those funds immediately when we're voting on it. So tying this current fiscal year to the tax levy that we don't receive until the following fiscal year, it complicates it a little bit to tie it directly to what we're asking for in the budget. So that's why I'm asking just about a conversational piece to help narrow down exactly what specific pieces of information you maybe feel like you're not getting.
I don't want to put...
And there are a lot of reasons that we tie it to that fiscal year too.
Sure. I would say from the conversations I've had, you know, these 3+ years when it comes to this topic, you can never start early enough, right? So if it's like, hey, here's what staff is going to recommend the levy be set at, but we've already had 100 days of, you know, here's your lead pipe replacement. Here's all these things that are coming, and we started talking about it in 4th of July because now you're getting a sense of, wow, here's potentially all the recommended things we need to do. And now when you get to the property tax levy part, now it doesn't feel like, well, you're setting the level of what, in that kind of backwards, because you're going to have enough of a debate on, you know, you can't replace this, you can't, you know, we can't fund those things, but we've already had those conversations about what we might want to do before you've set the number.
And I think earlier discussion is a much simpler answer than not knowing specifically what pieces of information, because that's something very reasonable and easy to correct. Right.
I would just close with, I don't want scheduling and timing to be the thing that people up here are, you know, I'll use arguing in a vague, but I don't want people to be battling over the timing and structure. And if I had this, I'd be okay to be here, because you're going to have enough tough conversations down the line when it comes to where do you want to put the pie. We can't keep growing this pie. Where do you want to put your emphasis? I want to focus that debate discussion, because that's really what this body's meant to do, not on the calendar of what should have come first. And now, you know, people aren't interested in listening.
Before we move on to Alderman Folks, maybe I think direction to you, City Administrator, would be, aside from the quarterly updates, because that's something different, that maybe we target September for when we do the traditional workshop, for some conversation about some of the carve-outs. But I would ask you, Alderman Bongard, to, you know, provide staff some components that you'd like to see, and if anyone else at this dais would like certain components for that September conversation, because then I think that sets a nice stage for walking into November, where everyone feels like, you know, maybe we can't get quite to the correct projection, but we can get to some topics that if people have a handle on some numbers or where they're at, then we might walk into November where it's a much easier conversation. Is that fair?
I think that's perfect.
Okay, so I know we have some other questions over here, Alderman Folks and then Alderman Sokaitis.
Yeah, I guess, Bill, just thank you for what you and your staff do. I know this isn't easy in coming up here and speaking in front of all of us too, with all of our quote-unquote demands. Looking at this looks like a lot of needs, more than anything. And I guess the one thing I'm looking for from city staff and from the rest of us up here is a proper way to prioritize those going forward. I don't have that answer. I don't know what the number 1, number 2, number 3 from each department really is. But what I am hoping for some is just some honest clarity from the group, that no one's really trying to push agendas and anything, because as we can see, everything's, like Ryan keeps saying, the pie keeps getting bigger here, and we know we have some tough decisions. So each year as we go through this, can we please prioritize and think needs overall of the city over wants, or maybe the most pressing ones moving forward as we go through and create this? Because like we said, it is not getting easier, and we only know our expenses are going to be greater, and that's just my ask. And I'm thankful for everything everybody does, but instead of just being like, hey, what would you like, a little bit of guidance coming from all of you moving forward would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
I think that can probably be intertwined with some of those conversations too. Thank you for that. Alderman Sokaitis.
Thank you. I want to go back to our reserves. You said we have about 40-odd million, correct?
No.
In that area. I don't need an exact number.
Okay, it was 40%, not 40%.
40, I'm thinking 40%, and we're, by policy, we are at 25%. Okay.
Minimum 25%.
First of all, do other cities have that kind of formula they use? Like,
Um,
I'm just curious about our neighbors and stuff. Do you, if you know, like, what is their policy for reserves?
It varies. I would say 25% is a fairly typical policy to have.
Okay.
Best practices have talked about having a much more in-depth evaluation of what your fund balance should be versus just saying 3 months of expenditures, because, like I said before, it's really based on, what other funding sources do you have in other funds for other items? Are you meeting all of your operating and capital needs? Do you have replacement funds? What other risks do you have in terms of economic shock or loss? So there's a lot of things that go into it, and we've had started to have some of those conversations internally so that we could evaluate that and determine if it should be a different number. I think that, like I said before, earlier in the discussion, I'm happy and comfortable with where we're at. I think there's some small wiggle room there, but based on our total financing and funding picture, given the needs and mandates we have out there, I'd be hesitant to set a lower level and what those impacts might be.
Now, when these credit ratings, Moody's and stuff, they go into it, do they look at your policy, but then they look at what your actual number is, correct? So when do they start getting concerned? Let's say we're at 40, they start getting concerned if we went to 28. Do you think that would affect our thing? Okay. I'm not asking to go there. I'm just asking a general question. I don't want to do that.
There's a variety of things they would look at in that context. What is the cause? And what are the trends, and what is the overall financial picture of the entity?
Okay.
So.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Anything else before we move on?
Just one thing. So if, I'm hearing my colleagues correctly, and I'm not disagreeing with them, and I appreciate their comments. And of course, my other Fourth Ward colleague, who's beating the drum of, talking about the budget before we decide on the levy. I'm hearing that we're going to have difficult decisions coming up, which I don't disagree with, but more frequent communication is what we're asking essentially. And keep me honest, my colleagues up here. If that's the case, I totally agree, and I just want to leave with, we've been asking for a while for that, and so I think hopefully this discussion finally hits home that we want it. So.
Yeah, and I do want to just emphasize too, I know that Bill has done a lot of work in terms of reporting and different documents that we've been giving to council as well. So there have been a lot of tweaks that we've been making in the background to try to get some of those statistics and information out to city council in a digestible format. So then you have something to look back at as well. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear that I'm not ignoring that request, that we've been trying to find different ways and different avenues to get that information.
And apologies if my tone is that accusatory, but I agree. I mean, I agree with Paul. I like the quarterly idea. I mean, we don't have to make decisions. I'm not talking about a line-by-line comb, if you will, through the budget. But, again, it makes sense to me that if we're going to make difficult decisions moving forward, we need to be more frequently updated and be able to provide you with feedback. And not necessarily, hey, take out line 2 or something like that, but... You get my drift, so that's my comment.
Yeah, to my colleague's point, I've been asking for this for years, I think 3 years now. So if we can get something in September and quarterly like Paul has suggested, I think that would be great. For me, it's just when you go out there and you talk with your constituents, you want to be able to explain where the money's going to justify any sort of increase. So if we're raising the property tax levy increase, and I know only partially where it's going, and somebody says, well, why did it get raised? Well, it goes in the general fund. Well, where's it going? I don't know. So for me personally, I don't know about everybody else. I like to be able to tell somebody and explain to them, and most of the times they understand. If you explain to them what's going on, here's the situation, this is where we're at, they're understanding of it. But if I go in there and I say, I don't know, I'll let you know in March or April, that's not a good answer to give them. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with all of that. I understand the needs, so I appreciate it if we can have it a little bit sooner.
You're good? Good? Everyone good? Good on this side? Excellent. Thank you so much for your work. And Director Hannah's door is always open. I know that because a few of the individuals down here see you on a regular basis. So if anyone has any questions, I know he's welcome and definitely answer them for you.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. Great job.
City Administrator, are we moving on, or you didn't want to hit, no more comments, sir? Okay, Director Conley, we're moving on to item 4.
Good evening. I'll be covering the last 2 items of the night. Both of these should be relatively quick. Both of them are only for discussion. The first one is discussion regarding an amendment to the Business Improvement Grant Program. Just to talk a little bit about the existing program so we know what the changes are. So the existing program is a grant for businesses or property owners. They use the grant funds for structural improvements to the private commercial property, things like plumbing, electric, life safety, among other things. But the idea is that it isn't really a grant for the business specifically, it's for the building. So if that business, goes out of business, unfortunately, then the next person moving in will benefit from those improvements. Today it is a 50-50 grant, so if someone invests $20,000 into their property, then they're eligible for a $10,000 grant. Maximum grant is $25,000. Grant under $10,000 can be approved by staff. A lot of businesses or property owners like this just because it kind of expedites the process, and usually these are small enough that they just kind of want to get them done with. And then the typical annual budget for this is $50,000, and it does come from our general fund. Just a little bit of history in 2023 and 2024. These are a list of all of our grant recipients. A majority of them received about $10,000. You can see the ones at the bottom, which were approved last year. The Office and Maple Leaf Roasters, they got $25,000 apiece. Those were approved by City Council. Just 3 of them that I'll point out was Brown Butter. They did an addition which added an outdoor patio and service window to their location. The Veterans Center added an ADA ramp to their entrance. And then La Mesa did a door installation to access their outdoor patio. The proposed changes, broadly, these are just 3 changes in here. Increases are an increase to the maximum grant amount from $25,000 to $30,000. Increase with the staff approval level from $10,000 to $15,000. And then lastly, increase to the reimbursement for the ADA improvements from 50% to 75% with a maximum of $10,000. This item, or the changes were put in front of the E&I Commission for this reason, for improving the ability to get more grant money for the ADA improvements. This was just because there's been an uptick in the amount of comments we've got that we want the city to focus on these improvements more and more. So the rationale, increasing the grant amount simply because of inflation. $10,000 doesn't go as far as it used to. This grant program was originally implemented in 2015. So costs have gone up quite a bit from that, and just want to kind of keep raising that to keep pace with it. And then, as I said, more focus on ADA improvements. One thing that I won't be asking for approval when this goes for committee, but it is a consideration, is that the Economic Development Department is requesting an increase in funding from $50,000 to $120,000. Obviously, we are in the middle of a budget process, so this is undetermined as we go through that process. Staff may determine we're going to lower that, or City Council can kind of weigh in on that, but that is where we're at today, but it could be adjusted. And with that, I can take any questions or comments.
Yes, Alderman Petrella.
We talked earlier, Derek, thanks for your, doing this. I would support, I know we're not voting on it, but I would support these general efforts. I think it's prudent for our health of our businesses.
Okay.
Any other comments, Alderman Weber?
No, Derek, thanks for putting this together. I think obviously businesses, especially downtown, are the lifeblood of our city. So any investment that we do along with them, I think goes a long way. Obviously, we have growth in our revenue, so to increase something like this, we obviously get a return on it. So I like that it's getting readdressed, because you're right. Things that what 10,000 can get you in 2015 versus 2024 is a big difference. So thank you.
Alderman Besser.
I know, Derek, we had a conversation as well. Thank you again. I guess my only question is, your funding currently for this year is
tapped out, correct?
Yeah, I used up all the 50,000 within a month of last year's.
And that's been the trend over the last couple of years?
Since I've been here, we've used all the grant funds. And I should say that I've already got several inquiries for next year.
Okay, I agree with it. There's a need then. Thank you very much.
Alderman Ginn.
Yep. No, thank you, Derek. I know we've had discussion and also being involved a little bit and listening in with the E&I Commission and kind of their goal and obviously being involved in this. And I think increasing it overall is great. As I said, inflation has eaten up that $10,000. You could use that in a heartbeat. But also focusing on the ADA components, especially to make our downtown businesses or the building that they're in much more accessible for people that have that need, I think would increase traffic and get people in the places that right now they cannot get to. So I really applaud it and support it fully. Thank you.
Alderman Warfel.
Yeah, just, I support what you want to do. It's great. Thank you.
Anyone over here?
Well, you would
Alderman
both
Lund.
sides.
I don't want to be redundant, but I agree with everything that they've said.
I was talking to Ryan.
I agree with everything that they said. You know, the cost increase is definitely necessary. The ADA improvement up to 75% is even better because that's badly needed by certain areas just to get people in and out. And, you know, just investing in the businesses, in the facades of those is really helpful for those businesses and any, you know, traffic that we're getting into the city for commerce. So very supportive.
Thank you for that. Alderman Bender?
So the use, everybody agrees with, yeah, it's great. Where does the money come from?
It comes from the general fund.
From the property tax levy?
Yes.
Right. So again, I think when you talk about timing, right, so everybody up here says it's great, but then we have a split, or we have people not voting, you know, for property tax levy recommended amounts, but then are quick to come back and say, love it, great use. And I would like in the future to be able to turn that around to say, hey, here's something we'd like to recommend doing, but we won't be able to do it if you guys aren't comfortable meeting our recommended property tax. So that, you went 7 people down the line, everybody says, great idea, gotta do it. 2 months ago, you know, it's 5-4 coming out of committee. And I think this is a perfect example moving forward of what I'd like to have those discussions, debate ahead of time, so we're not doing them different ways.
Understood.
But I think it's a great idea. It's fantastic.
Good feedback. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 5.
Okay. Presentation of industrial occupancy study for 2025. So if you remember, about 4 or 5 months ago, we did an occupancy study for our downtown storefronts, which were about 96% occupied, which was great. And we just got a lot of positive feedback for doing that study, which is not something a lot of cities are able to do. So we did have some conversations with some brokers, and they thought it'd be great to do a very similar study for our industrial sector. So again, partnered with the Business Alliance with this, and they did a lot of the grunt work. Specifically, thank you to Nate at the Business Alliance. He did a lot of work on this. The data was collected in December of 2022. You know, a month ago or so. Findings, we have about 9.3 million square feet of industrial space in St. Charles. I think I've said this since I've got here. You probably heard me say it, but the industrial sector of St. Charles makes up a large portion of our local economy, and it doesn't always get the credit. I think people think of our downtown and how great it is and the dining, but this is a significant portion of our local economy. In total, we're calculating about 351 in total industrial spaces. This is big and small, so I count Smithfield Foods as one big one, and then you have these small ones that may only be about 3,000 square feet. On the right-hand side, you do see a map. We did partner with our GIS department, thanks to them. So they did make this visually accessible on our website, so you can go on and see what properties are vacant, what are occupied, and what are partially occupied. So this is kind of the smaller part. This is on our west side, where we only have about 500,000 square feet of industrial. I'll flip to the next page. On the right-hand side there, you can see our GIS map, and this is our bigger industrial area. The green is occupied, and I'm happy to report that there's a lot of green on the map. The red is vacant, and then the orange is partially vacant. So you have multi-tenant buildings in there, and you can see it broken. You can see that, you know, some of those spaces are empty. So again, 98% occupied by total square footage, which is absolutely amazing. National average right now is about 7.5% vacant. So we're certainly above the national average, and expecting this to continue. This has been a hot market ever since, honestly, since COVID and the supply boom that occurred. So expecting this to stay high. The total vacancy is about 177,000. Those are primarily made up of these three vacant buildings that I have up here, the biggest one being 60,000 square feet. So this report is completed and is on the Economic Development webpage, so you can see it in its entirety. It does have a list of all the industrial businesses that we do have in St. Charles as well.
Thank you for that. Alderman Bongard.
Can you walk us through just the time it takes to complete that study, the cost, because I'm just so everybody knows what that, I think people take for, well, Utah, sorry.
Yeah, this is something that I think most cities want to have their hands on, but a lot don't do just because it is so labor intensive. And honestly wouldn't have been able to do it without NAID at the Business Alliance. Really it starts out with just going through Google Maps and kind of just mapping it out and seeing what you can find out, but then you literally have to drive around on the streets and verify who is in what building and look for signs and sometimes knock on the door and see, and going around it is extremely time consuming. And then also taking that information, putting it into a spreadsheet, and then taking it to GIS and have them do what they need to do. Very time consuming. It's hard to put hours on it, but we're probably talking about, per study, probably 50 hours of work to put in this framework. Now, we can do this year after year, and it's going to be a little bit easier on us. But certainly somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 hours of work in total. If you were to pay a consultant to do this, not that I know a lot of firms that do this, but just based off experience, it would probably cost $25,000, maybe $30,000 to do something like this. So.
Yes, Alderman Weber.
Derek, thank you so much for putting this together. Obviously, this is a great tool for you and your department as people call and, ask for availability. You have very pertinent, very accurate information, and as someone that does some real estate, looking for opportunities, if I wanted to come to St. Charles, when something comes up, I would be very anxious to jump on something right away because obviously it's very desirable to do business here. So I'm glad that you have this baseline model all put together now because it'll help you with your endeavors. So thank you very much.
Alderman Guzman.
This is really wonderful, and I have two questions about the future use for this. One would be, does this demonstrate that there's a value for some sort of registry for businesses? And I'm not talking about financially, like asking for licenses or anything like that, but some way of maintaining some kind of upkeep of this so that we have an ongoing, regular keeping up with the information. And then my second question sort of piggybacks on that. Is there another application for which this is helpful within the city?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're already doing some brainstorming on that. So it is great. I do have a list of all the businesses in St. Charles, but I don't have their contacts, like who the right person to contact is. So that's something that some type of registry would really help out with. I do think that there are ongoings at the city, for example, the IMEA contract, where some of these businesses who are heavy electric users, they may want to get involved and learn more about that, so that could be a tool to communicate with them.
What about emergency services?
Oh, I'm sorry. Absolutely. I know in talking with the fire department, that is absolutely something that they would like to know, because sometimes businesses can go into buildings and the city doesn't know. There's nothing required. They don't need a building permit or anything. Really, it's just someone driving by and realizing that someone's in that building. So.
And I'm going to emphasize that exact point, that comes up fairly frequently where we find out a business has opened after the fact and there's been no inspections from fire, there's been no inspections from building and code, and we're trying to chase them down after the fact. So I think that even, like you said, from a non-monetary perspective, there's some real value in having just the information and requiring some contact from a new business as they open.
So I guess my follow-up to that would be, is this something that, that this body should be talking about as far as direction to staff for some sort of mechanism for you to continue that work?
Well, it sounds like you might have just done that.
I'm happy to present again or a combination of staff. I know that we talked about it in 2021, and at that point, the existing council, which I know is not the exact same makeup right now, had declined to do that. But it's, at any point, we can revisit that conversation, absolutely.
Yeah, and that will take some time to research, honestly. It sounds simple, but I know a lot of cities have tried to implement it and then had to pull back. So it's very important that you do your research and really know how it's going to function.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for those comments. Alderman Volk.
Yeah, just a general question, because 98% is amazing. Is there any feedback from the businesses as to why they want to be here?
We did do about 15 retention visits with industrial businesses last year, so that report I think we did complete a couple months ago. It's in there, so I think the workforce was a big part of it. Something that we've talked about recently is just the reliability of our electric service here that is owned by St.Charles. So reliability can be very important because a lot of these firms are they're manufacturers. This is not, the majority are manufacturers, not logistics. And if they have some type of power outage, that could be extremely detrimental to their business. So those are some of the things that they brought up.
I think a couple other things they did say were being near like industrial or manufacturing businesses that they can share services with. And in many cases in our industrial areas, there is room for growth. So many of them have said they're looking for square footage and they've found locations where they know they can get it and or they know there's a possibility down the road. So we've heard that in many of our business and many of them have already expanded. So
I just think it's great. I think whatever is happening, what we're doing and what you're doing it's phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything over here? More. Okay. Thank you so much, Director.
Thank you, Derek.
I think at this point, we're moving on to item 6, and this will be led by City Administrator.
This is less led by me and more receiving the feedback from councils as we've done the last handful of workshops that we've conducted. If there's any other initiatives, I think business registration is the type of initiative we're talking about that you would like staff to look into or pursue and present on. Not really intended to be large capital projects necessarily as we address those during budget season, but anything else that you would like us to look into.
And I think in addition to that, great feedback tonight from council on things that their expectations, what they would like to see moving forward.
Quarterly updates, got it.
It all down there. And I think that, certainly, just to add on to Alderperson Munz's comments, there are a lot of things that I know, Derek, I believe that you will be sharing with council over the next couple of months on things that have changed and we are doing that are different that will help augment what Alderperson Munz is looking for, I think, too.
And if I can also add, I know you already mentioned this, Mayor, but doing a strategic plan update in the summer, I think, is a really crucial time to address some of these things. As a staff, it does really take some time to implement research, find budgeting money to prioritize these projects. So that is a really great opportunity as a vision perspective for council to direct staff on how to implement those things. But certainly there are going to be things that come up throughout the years and months that we want to look at, tackle, or even prepare for that strategic plan process. So we're always available tonight or other nights as well to answer those questions and start looking into those.
And I think regarding number 6, great comments, thank you for that. We'll just start over to the right with Alderman Spilkaitis. If there's anything you wanted to add to City Administrator's question about things that you'd like to see over the next couple of months.
Well, going back to the budget, I would like to see more transparency, I would have liked to have seen actually some numbers of what we're anticipating.
Are you talking about in terms of revenue, or expenditures?
Oh, both, actually. I like to, that's kind of what I was expecting. We would see more of, here's what we believe is going to happen May 1st. Here's our expenditures that we think, and here's our project, hard numbers, and that way we can make a decision on how do you prioritize A, B, or C.
Sure.
And I understand it's a process, but I would like to see us at least head in that direction, so we can have this meetings like this, but where the people can actually, okay, here's the numbers, we can get their input.
Sure.
But that's the biggest thing.
Yep, there are, last year, I think, was the first year that we presented a full draft, second year that we presented a full draft budget. And prior to Bill's tenure, my tenure, that book actually was not presented to council. But we do publish that in addition to the presentation of that draft budget. That will be done in early April, March. What were we targeting? Sometime in that window there, with those exact numbers. But I do want to just remind council that a majority of our budget is operational, contractual services, employment services that do not really change significantly year to year. And then the smaller projects are really managed by staff in terms of what we need to do. So those big capital projects are really those vision-setting items that are directed by council that we're working on prioritizing.
But those little things that we don't really see, but they are hard numbers. And that way we can say, okay, is there something we can do here? I mean, I'm not talking about the big problem. I'm talking about, do we need to spend $50,000 on this? This is what I'm kind of leaning toward.
Sure, and that draft budget will be presented to City Council, absolutely. Those numbers are not hidden, those are published, those are presented online. I would, again, just caution City Council on getting too far into the weeds of some of those projects and some of those smaller things that are managed generally at a staff level by both me and then all the department directors as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Polk?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again for everything you guys do and everything you guys present and come up with. And just keep us as best informed as we can of what is the most pressing needs, because I think that's our basic job up here, is to hear those needs and then decide as a group how we move forward with the needs that are best going to serve everybody. Thank you.
One is, I think we did this in the past, but just taking a look at the different ordinances that are still on the books and, it's, 4 years, 2 years later, just taking another look through that of what maybe needs to get updated or changed. The other thing I'll just say is the word transparency makes me uncomfortable because I think, Bill, you have been phenomenal, Heather as well, and all the department directors. Transparency is a word that makes it seem like, there's something that is not being transparent. And it's not this body's job to go line by line and do, line item budgeting. That's why we have staff department directors. At the same time, I think it's clear, what may have worked in the past with city councils of, well, this is how we present it. I think this group would probably be more comfortable or work more efficiently if they had an idea of, hey, we're going to set spending at X and then to decide what we're going to be able to prioritize based on your recommendation and what's available. But I just want to be careful. Transparency is, it just seems like, well, we're doing things, I don't think that's the case. I think, just the timing moving along. So if we could really focus in on what that might look like and how to make it work, I think that'd be great.
And if I can just take a moment, just because you made the comment, I think that all the directors that are up here have done a really great job of listening to the feedback and making sure that all the decisions that we're asking council to make, we are providing as much information as possible and more, I think, than has ever been provided in the past, like you said, as a function of different councils and different expectations. So I want to thank all the staff that's up here and all the directors for doing that and really just bringing forth as much information as possible and really thoroughly researching everything before it's presented.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for all of the work that went into everything that you presented tonight. I don't have much of a baseline other than what I've seen this year and last year and then seen as a resident in previous years, but it's a different comparison level. So I would echo the sentiments of Alderman Bongard that I think that our expectations as a whole body has probably changed from what you may have been used to in the past, and I think we ask more questions altogether than what you may be used to, or ask for more detail. And I know that any time I've met with any one of you, you give me everything I'm looking for. So transparency is absolutely there, and I think maybe if some more of that can come in the public meetings, it helps not just us, but it helps our residents. And, I try to check. I don't always remember to, but it seems like we do have people that dial into these. I know that we have people that watch them later. And I think that as we, improve the accessibility to this, we'll have more people that watch them. And we want to make sure that they know what's going on. And it makes our jobs easier as representatives, and I think overall makes your jobs easier as staff when we can do that. So.
My big part is obviously it's been one of my goals since becoming an alderman is finance committee, and the quarterly updates. But it's been said, but I don't think it can be said enough. The things that we're talking about are improvements. They're terrific improvements, and the group up there has made great improvements to our cities, and I appreciate that. But with quarterly finance meetings, what does our management information look like? Instead of, a download dump, payroll, operations, fixed costs, contractual, strategic, kind of layered through with run rate. Like I was talking about matching revenues and costs to say like, okay, total dollar, length of time, so you can kind of take a look at, from a monthly perspective. Well, and I'm not talking about just 1 month at a time, but, what like a 12-month look back and 12-month look forward looks like, but in a way that it's formatted, that it's management information more than, just reported information. That's kind of hard to dig through. So it's a little bit more, useful, and then dig in with like, okay, what's coming up, just so we have simple bulleted priorities that we can then debate over. That's what I'm looking for from that, but that's really, you guys are doing a great job, and I think we've made great improvements, and I appreciate you all.
Yep. I'll echo everything to my right. Great job, everybody. All my meetings have been full of information, helped me at least inform a decision, which we all need to. Getting the quarterly updates probably is a good thing as we go forward, and then everybody's aware of it. Citizens know what we're doing. Here's the list of priorities that we're now up against, and much of what Alderman Lencioni said is a lot of these are necessary, not necessarily improvements, they're just repairs that, as we've heard today, have been deferred. And now our residents and our businesses that we've just heard are looking for those improvements to keep their business sustainable. And that's part of all of our collective jobs, is to provide the best service and community to everybody that comes here. So my hat's off to all you guys. You do a tremendous job. It helps us to make those decisions, but I think it helps all of us to be better stewards of what we've been given. So thank you all very, very much.
Alderman Petrella, anything else?
Again, I just want to reiterate, if you want to call it an initiative, I'm agreeing with my colleagues. For me, maybe the phrase or the concept of more frequent information sharing rather than using transparency. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable or anything like that, but I think basically information sharing more frequently is very important for me, and we're going to prioritize. I need the information to make the discerning, decisions, so.
Alderman Warbaugh.
Two things. With regards to transparency, for me, it's about me being transparent with my constituents. It's not about you being transparent with me. So for me, I think you're very upfront and tell me what I need to know so I can convey it to my constituents. So the only thing I ask for, we can look into, is a messaging system. Larry, I think if we can get some communication to residents, like road closures, any emergency situations, Clark mosquitoes coming around on a certain day so people can close their windows. I've been asked that quite frequently. If we could just have like a text messaging or email system in place, that's something I think I would be interested in.
There is a piece of that we've been working on rolling out, starting with emergency services first, and then being able to roll that out in conjunction with our new website to the mass for the other notifications.
I would just add, I don't, echo everybody's comments, but I would just say thank you all. You're all extremely accessible, and everyone's been quick to respond to just about any need that I've had in our ward. Thank you very much.
Going last is, obviously you don't really have much to add, so I'm just going to say thank you once again. Obviously we have a very high quality of life in St. Charles, and then all the department heads, all the city staff, all the people in the meeting. Obviously we work very hard to continuously maintain and improve the quality of life here. So thank you for what you do, and I feel like we are achieving that, so thank you.
A couple comments from me. Great discussion up here, thank you. Having the experience of being on council for 4 years prior, I can say that questions from Alderman Pearson's up here have been different than maybe in years past. So we have a new finance director. I'll still give you the new title because you haven't been around that long, and a CA too. And I know that I know that the council appreciates the feedback that they're able to give you. DOOR works both ways, so thank you for always being that way. I do want to thank the individuals over the gym, Tara Marjano, because I don't think they get thanked enough, and we came here early today. And also, he never gets recognized, but John Harrell is our treasurer, and he does spend a tremendous amount of time with Bill Hanna, probably the most involved treasurer we've ever had. So thank you for that. You really do the treasurer work. I know Bill would agree, right? Thank you. And thank you to our residents that are here today and paying attention to the finances of the city. That's very much appreciated. And then all of our city staff, too, and the council. I appreciate all the work you put in. I know many of you spend extra hours doing the work, and I appreciate that, and you all do. So thank you. And with that, I think we have public comment. Anyone? Well, anybody else have something to say? All right. Well, you just have to say your name for the record, Trudy.
Thanks. My name is Trudy Nickel. My family's been around St. Charles for over 100 years. And one of the things I've loved most about this town all my life is how we all pull together, look out for each one another, and help one another. I'm also a member of the Equity and Inclusion Commission. My alderman up there, one of my aldermen comes to our meetings frequently, Derek, as well as Jen and Peter and Russ have all been so cooperative as I go to meet with them about the issues that I have taken on. I'll give you two guesses what they are. Aside from being a commissioner, I've been an amputee for 15 years now. The majority of challenges, the first thing I have to say is I hate the word disabled. I hate it with a passion. The mayor has heard me say this because when you hear of someone being disabled, well, it's like if a piece of equipment is disabled. Well, it doesn't work. Well, that's just not true. In today's world, folks with challenges, physical challenges, as I prefer to say, are fully functional, independent individuals who can participate at every level in our government. We're all familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Do you know how old that thing is? That sucker was passed 35 years ago. 35 years ago, you didn't have the internet. 35 years ago, we didn't have cell phones or Bluetooth or email or anything else. Well, those technological advances have also impacted the community of those of us with challenges. For example, a couple of my buddies are right here on board with me. For those with hearing issues, you guys all look too young to have hearing aids up there, but I got a couple pals back here who do. And Bluetooth, what Bluetooth can do for folks with hearing issues is amazing. It's almost like dialing into a radio station. They walk in the room, if it is appropriately fixed, they hear everything. Folks with vision issues, there now is laser surgery that has done a great deal to improve that. Folks like me, the first wheelchair I got weighed about 60 pounds. Holy moly, you try and toss that sucker around. My one today weighs about 20 because of the fact that there are materials today that make them so much lighter. For those of us who wear prosthetics, hi Alderman, for those of us who wear prosthetics, we're frankly bionic. You can get a bionic arm that moves back and forth. You can get bionic fingers. You can get a bionic ankle. But all those things happen only if that is available to you. As those who run our city, you have some really important jobs in front of you, obviously. As far as city governance goes, I know this word up there became unpopular for a moment, but it is very true in what I'm going to talk about. Transparency. Transparency to me means that I am aware and can participate in every form of government. Every meeting that you have, anytime I have anything to say. Well, for those with hearing issues, that's not the case. The hearing aids do not cut out the excess noise. And believe it or not, there's excess noise. So hearing in a meeting like this is extraordinarily challenging. There is a new way to fix that. It is called looping. I think many of you are familiar with it. I'm looking at one of my aldermen, Bob, up there. They did it in his church. And again, it is what I've talked about when someone with hearing issues comes in and immediately their Bluetooth picks up on what is being said. From a sight impairment issue, one of the other larger, big responsibilities that you have is keeping St. Charles safe and accessible for all of us who want to get around in it. This I'm thinking about specifically for my friend Sam back there, who I see in the back of the room, who I believe has spoken to you more than once. It's true in different areas. A big one that Sam actually pointed out to me was the intersection of East Main and Kirk Road. That is a tragedy waiting to happen. And the more wonderful developments that happen out there and the more people who want to get to them who may not be able to drive, well, they try and get there. There's a terrible possibility of something tragic happening to them or anyone else getting to walk across, and which is true about all of our crosswalks. I was shocked to realize there's not one audible stoplight in the city of St. Charles. I know Sam's been bumped by a car before more than once. How is he supposed to know when you can cross the street, or many others who are in the same challenge? Now, I know that Peter down there is promoting is to get the addressing the issue of the intersection of East Main and Kirk Road changed. It's not just making a study of it. Plans are going to be put together and action is to be taken. Is it going to cost money? Well, yes, it is. And we'll find the money as I look at you. Additionally, I know that there will be audible stoplights beginning on First Street. Yes, and that will happen before the end of this year, but that should also be discussed throughout St. Charles. We have a great downtown. Finally, for folks like me who have mobility issues, the people who are faced with these are obviously, they're obvious ones. Wheelchairs, walkers, canes, crutches, right? But it also includes, I am my 91-year-old mother's caregiver. She doesn't walk anymore. I did not get Mom in her wheelchair in and out of places, not to mention the parents of children with disabilities who have limited participation around town. But if the Equity and Inclusion Commission is concerned, I'm solely here to talk to you about issues that are under the guidance or supervision of the city of St. Charles itself. So the big one is bathrooms. How boring, right? But so do we have accessible bathrooms is the question. Well, most folks would say, yes, we do. And do we meet the ADA compliance thing? Well, yeah, if that's all you want to do. Is there a stall big enough to turn your wheelchair around in? Oh, yeah, probably, hopefully. Is there a toilet at the appropriate height that you would just slide off your chair or whatever it is to get on? Yeah. But can you open the door? So Jen over here was good enough to make a tour around the city with myself, my people back here, okay, to which we kind of went through building by building and talked about where the city is on that. For my purposes as a person with a mobility issue, opening those, and I want you to think about how this would be if this were you. Try to open one of the bathroom doors that does not have automatic entry if you were in a wheelchair, or if you were using a walker or on crutches. Here's how it goes, to give you a slight demonstration. So the door's here, right? So to get in, I have to pull the door while trying to get my wheelchair in there in a straight line, letting the door hit me on the way as I try to get in, bang me in my wheelchair, and then hopefully I get in. it's not any better getting out. Well, then I just kick the door, you know. But I actually have that ability when many don't. I know it is being proposed in your budgets this year that this, I know we talk about, I've heard that redoing this chamber is going to cost money and where we're going to get it from, but there is looping in this year's proposed budget. There is a part of this year's budget that addresses, because Jen McMahon taught me in our first meeting, now Trudy, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time, as I'm rolling in with this list of all these things. I know that there is a proposal to have our line item to have automatic doors put in the bathroom at the police department. That's great. But here in this building, no. Could anyone with a mobility issue be hired to work here in this building? Well, no, because there's no bathroom that anyone could use during the course of a workday. Now, to me, well, you know, that's discriminatory. It's been said to me, well, you know, Trudy, there's only so much money. Well, when you say something like that, you might as well say that you folks just don't matter. You don't make the cut. You don't make the cut. The disabled community is the largest minority group in America who is consistently treated as second-class citizens. Please, please, make the city of St. Charles catch up to where we are. We have challenges. We are not disabled. Hearing that kind of response, well, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, that's shameful. And it's not what this town has been about since it was created. So, I have faith. I have faith in each and every one of you that when you go to look at the budgets, and yes, maybe there are cuts to be made, do not set aside your neighbors, your voters, your friends again. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. I'm sure all of you want to meet me individually after this, but I am around.
Thank you, Trudy, and thank you for your service on E&I too. Thank you.
Hi, Sam Parker. I think some of you know me already. Another night I learned a lot. CapEx, wow, it's a bitch, huh? Appreciate seeing the funds, you know, being considered for the crosswalk that I was talking about. I hear, oh, sorry, yeah, there you go.
Yes, there you go.
So,
yes, thank you.
appreciate seeing the money in for the crosswalks at Kirk and 64, and I hear a lot of words about prioritize tonight, and let me just maybe help prioritize a little bit. I see more money being proposed for the crosswalks at Foxfield, at Dunham, and at Kirk. I use those crosswalks. While I'd love them to be audible, at least they're there. I can cross those intersections at all four ways, no problem. There's nothing at Kirk Road. So that money should go there. And it looks like we're proposing extending Campton Hills from Peck to Kirk. Is that for development of business or something? Nobody knows?
What are we talking about, walkability? Bike and ped lane.
Yeah.
Oh, bike and hood, okay.
I'm sorry, it was what?
Pedestrian.
It's a pedestrian?
Pedestrian improvements for sidewalk connections.
From Peck to Oak on Campton Hills?
Yeah, right in front of Fire Station 3.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I didn't think it connected to Oak yet. That's where my confusion was. Okay. Well, anyway, there was the one, and I'm glad that the conversation has started, and I look forward to continuing it. But I do think that we can maybe make some adjustments here, and I certainly hope that we are focused on making it a four-way crosswalk intersection. So, but thank you. I do appreciate the fact that we are having the conversation. So, look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
Any other public comments? Sure, come on up.
Hi, I'm Steve Leffler. I live downtown in Milestone Row over by, will be Whole Foods. Looking forward to that. But I had questions about water. Our water isn't great. In fact, it's really hard and kind of sucks and doesn't taste all that good. And I've got a whole house filter. I've got a water softener, and I've got a triple osmosis to get it to be at the point where I feel comfortable drinking it. And it looks like we're going to be spending a lot of money on water or water systems and capital expenditures. Is that going to solve our problem, or are we spending all this money and not necessarily solving the problem? Should we be, talking, like doing what other communities do and go get some Lake Michigan water, which is pretty darn good water?
That's a complicated answer, and I think maybe the first point is to talk with our public works director and maybe have your water tested to see exactly what we're looking at before we respond with any further commentary.
Okay. I'm in a new building, relatively new building with what should be pretty prime spot for, typical water supply, so.
Thank you. So we'll connect you to Pete, Director Sir.
Okay.
Good.
And I also want to ask a similar question about electric, because our electric rates, I used to own Suburban Tire here, and I'd spend $1,200 every month on an electric bill. And I know that it was the most expensive electric bill I had anywhere on all the rest of the communities I had the business. And I'm wondering why is it so expensive here? And I guess that's probably another question.
It probably is. Typically in public comment, we offer comments and questions. We tend to defer to if you could speak with the director, because in case it's specific, there might be a specific answer in your case. So that would be the same person, Director Sir, that you two can connect. I think you can get his number there, and you guys can communicate a little bit on that.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Anything from council, staff, that's remaining? No? Okay. We do not have an executive session, so I just need a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Moved by Munn, seconded by Foltz.
Who's ready?
Marjana, will you please call the roll?
Fulkitis,
Yeah.
Folks,
Yes.
Bungard,
Yes.
Munn,
Yes.
Lencioni, Gem,
Yes.
Petrula,
Yes.
Warble,
Yes.
Bessner,
Yes.
Weber.
Yes.
Thank you.